Chapter 6. The Mess Hall. Bill Grieva. Freedom's smile. Goes to her room. Liberty. Slaps Jinx in the head. Budsworth's reflection. Cade's request. 1997. The halls of the slaughterhouse were cold and slick underfoot, and the concrete was darkened by old blood that no mop had ever rightly lifted. The iron rafters overhead groaned under their own weight, and Bud walked under them. In front of him, his gaze fell upon Evan and little Dawson. They were in the hallway a ways in front of Bud, facing each other widthwise. "Shit's settling wrong," Dawson was saying. Evan grunted and nodded, squinting over the smoke curling from his lip. Bud didn't stop. He gave them a brief nod and they returned it, quick and wary, the way you'd nod to a dog you weren't sure was friendly. This annoyed Bud, but he didn't make it known. The mess hall smelled of boiled potatoes and bleach and something else Budsworth could never identify. Rows of battered steel tables ran the length of the room, most of them half occupied by black-tied men hunched over tin plates. Maybe 25 heads in all. They sat in loose knots. Men with knives tucked into their belts and hunger glinting in their eyes, even when they weren't looking at the food. The walls were streaked with old water damage, and overhead bulbs buzzed and flickered like agitated cicadas. Bud made his way to a corner table where nobody else had set their plate yet. The scrape of his boots sounded too loud. All around, conversation floated like fog, broken by sharp barks of laughter that didn't sound like laughter at all. There were no banners here, no colors hung in pride. Only the smell of old meat and men too long past salvation. Bud sat down, the metal chair groaning under his weight. He rocked to one side, and the chair fell to one leg, then to the other side, and the chair fell to the shorter leg. Bud let out a sigh of annoyance. For a long while he just stared at the empty plate before him. Bill Grieva was the first to sit next to Bud, followed by Mallory Gluskin right after. The stink of sweat and gun oil came off Bill like heat from a stove. Mallory sat down, her dirty blonde hair bouncing loose and half wild, catching the light of the dying bulbs. "You ain't getting no grub?" Bill said, flashing a wide, lopsided grin that showed the crooked chip of a tooth. "Just here to sit and hold hands with us, huh?" Bud grunted. "Wanted to sit down first." Bill chuckled and leaned back, making the chair creak. "Ain't no shame in it. You ain't hungry yet. Just one of the company." He looked over at Mallory, half waiting for her to laugh or snort, but she only shrugged. Pulled at the cuffs of her jacket. "I doubt it," she said, voice flat. Her brown eyes were heavy-lidded, and the small pulse of a vein beat high on her forehead, and her body fat was low enough to see the veins that ran through her forearms and biceps, uncommon for a woman, and she looked like she could be pretty if life had been softer. Bill set down his dented tin plate heavy with gray stew and a wedge of hard bread, made a point of it, rattling the thing on the table like a dealer laying down cards. "You like that, huh? Go on and get some." Bud gave a thin smile, a little nod, more out of politeness than anything real. I did it. I broke him. Bill reached a hand over and shook Mallory, and she smiled as she looked at her food. Bud glanced toward the buffet line, a battered fold-out table draped in stained canvas, where a few men lined up with their plates. I reckon I should eat, said Bud. Bill leaned over to Mallory with a grin. He don't gotta act so tough about being hungry. Bill's sentence was half cut at the end with a laugh, and Mallory smiled, stopping mid-chew to not spit out her food. Bud shook his head and smiled without humor. Bill, why don't you shut up a moment? He said, still half smiling, pushing up from the chair. The floor under his boots was sticky, and the linoleum curled up at the seams. He grabbed a tray from the stack and shuffled down the line. Paula was in the apron today. She had arms like broomsticks, and she was taller than Bud, a woman with a long, wiry body like a man's. She slapped a ladleful of thick brown stew onto his tray. Recognizing his hands, she looked up. Buddy! She smiled. He acknowledged her. Paula. Steam lifted off the stew and smelled faintly of pepper and venison. When Bud sat down, Jinx was there too, scrawny as a crow and picking at his teeth with a nail. Bill and Mallory were talking about something Bud didn't bother catching, and the words ran like water over stones. He looked up without thinking and saw her. Freedom stood in the line, a plate in her hands, her dark hair tied back loose. She caught him looking and smiled, not wide, but enough. That smile that never meant just one thing. Ah, shit, Bud muttered under his breath. Jinx glanced up. What? She wants something from me, Bud said, his voice low and dry. Lucky you, Jinx snorted. Who are we talking about? Mallory asked, glancing up from her plate. Freed, Bud said, his mouth twisting around the name like it tasted bitter. Every time she starts with that smile, it's either she wants something or something else. The others laughed, a dry, tired sound. Budsworth watched Freedom from across the hall, half shadowed by the sway of bodies hunched in the food line. She didn't cross the room. She didn't sit with them. Bud turned back to his plate, the world closing up behind his eyes again. Jinx sat with a boot up on the rafter beneath the table, and he was plucking at a loose thread on his pant leg. Mallory sat stiff-backed, arms crossed, her fork resting untouched atop her tray. Bill hunched over his food like a dog guarding a prize, but he kept his eyes on Bud, like he was waiting for something. He was larger than average, especially in the gut. He was bald with a shaved head and some stubble. There wasn't much to look at with Bill. His eyes were baggy and almost sad in their neutral position. And he was a white man, but his skin was dark with age and sun and damaged pores. You know what it is? Bill said after a long minute, voice low and lazy like molasses. We ain't built to sit still. We ain't built to be happy neither. Put a man in a good place, give him a full belly, a soft bed. He'll find some way to kick it all to shit anyhow. Bud looked up, but not with his head, only his eyes, and he glared at Bill as he chewed. Where'd that come from? Bill shrugged. Jinx grinned at that, lips splitting open like a wound. Maybe war's the only thing keeps us from sinking into the dirt. We was made to hurt things. Some of us better at it than others. He glanced over at Bud as he said this. Bud said nothing. He shifted slightly, and his legs scraped against the chair leg. His face was blank but not hostile, just worn thin. Mallory gave a little shrug, the motion slight, but she didn't have the energy to argue. Her eyes lingered on Bud for a second before sliding back to her tray. Bill pushed his plate away a few inches and leaned in close, the table creaking under his bulk. Still, he said, voice lower, I've seen things, little things. Man giving up a coat in the cold. Somebody sharing bread they needed worse than the one they gave it to. Ain't all black. Jinx snorted. I'm all black. The group shifted their eyes to Jinx, and Budsworth didn't acknowledge him. What? Said Jinx. Not funny? Most of us, said Mallory with a rough voice like sandpaper. We ain't made for better. Not no more. You get what you are. You make peace with it. Bill shook his head slowly, sadly. I don't know. I think there's something left, some flicker somewhere. Maybe the lightfall is real. Maybe we're just too scared to look at it. Easier to tear things down than admit we ain't meant to. The hall lights buzzed and flickered overhead, and somewhere a metal tray clattered onto the floor. No one paid it any mind. Jinx stretched like a cat, popping his shoulders one by one. Hope's for suckers, he said. Hope will get you shot. Maybe, Bill said. Maybe it's all that's left between being a man and being a beast. Bud's gaze drifted across the room. The blackened rafters, the smudged walls, the faces buried in bowls and plates. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He barely heard them anymore. The world was something he floated above, that he was not supposed to get touched by. Even his own longing was faint, half-remembered. Bill watched him, leaned heavier on the table. Ain't it funny, he said. We all want some sort of safe haven or lightfall to give us salvation. He glanced at Jinx, then back at Mallory, who was now engrossed in the dialogue. Because we can never figure it out ourselves, Bill continued. Ask yourself, what kind of God creates man? Men who struggle against the wind to create good times and strive for some sort of peace and harmony that they themselves are destined to ruin. Every man, brothers, sisters, mothers and fathers, born to kill and create violence and chaos, and it all comes from their heads. Yet men will continue to fight against their own propensities, to achieve something that's only conceivable in the theory that that said man creates. So what then? A man can't understand his mind because his mind's always got to understand it with. Same mind that paints us these fake pictures. Question is, where do we get it from? Does that world we've never seen where everything's perfect, really exist? And if not, how could man's mind have created it? The rest of the table stared at him blankly, like a congregation waiting for the next line of a sermon. "You see what I'm getting at?" Bill said. "Must be a cruel God to have created man that way," said Nallery, sheepishly. "You believe that?" asked Bill. Bud looked at him slow, and the muscles in his face barely worked. "I don't know," Bud said. "Believe that," said Bill. And outside the mess hall, the wind scraped along the concrete like something alive and restless, looking for a way inside. Bud hunched over the table, his tray emptied but his eyes still working. Around him, the mess hall ticked and breathed like a living thing. Men gnawed at bread with yellow teeth, spoke low with their heads down, and the lights overhead buzzed fitfully, casting everyone half into shadow. Steam rose off cracked plates, boots scuffed on the concrete floor, and the stink of sweat and boiled meat laid thick over it all like tar. Jinx leaned forward on his elbows, his mouth half full. "What's going on with you?" he said. Bud didn't answer right away. He just stared across the room like he was trying to see something past the walls. "Where's Cade?" Bud finally said, voice low. Bill glanced up from his tray. "Cade?" he echoed. "He's talking about that new kid," Jinx said. He tore off a piece of bread with his teeth and chewed slow. Bill dropped his gaze back to the table. "He ain't here," Bud repeated. His fingers idly scratched the old scars on the back of his hand. "Could be he ain't hungry," Jinx said. He shrugged, nonchalant. "Probably one of his first times seeing bedding in." Bud's chair scraped loud against the floor as he stood. "I gotta go," he said. He carried his dirty plate over the pile stacked high by the exit. Flies buzzed at the corners where the scraps were smeared. He dropped his plate without ceremony and walked out of the mess. Behind him, the others watched in speculation, but no one called after him. The hallway beyond the mess was long and low-ceilinged, and the walls were streaked with old water stains, and the floor gritted with dirt and blood tracked in from the killing floors. Little Dawson and Evan were gone now, the space empty save for the low hum of the generators somewhere deep inside. Bud marched steady, boots striking a steady, hollow beat. He made for Freedom's room. Didn't know where Talon had stuck Cade. The door was closed. From inside he heard the scuff of movement, soft and hurried. Bud rapped on the door, slow and sure. "Freed," he said. He heard her footsteps, and the door swung open almost at once. Freedom stood there, backlit by the low yellow lamplight of her room. Her hair was loose and rough around her face, and she looked tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. "Hey," she said. Bud didn't waste a second. "What do you want?" Freedom's smile was small and tight at the edges. "I was wanting something," she said, feigning ignorance. "I know you do. I know that smile," Bud said. Freedom gave a real one then, all slyness and trouble. "Smile's a smile," she said. Yours ain't, Bud said. He stepped inside without waiting for an invite. The door drifted shut behind him, and the air in the room was warmer than the hall, close with the smell of old blankets, leather, gun oil, and some cheap floral soap. Freedom stood stiff, arms crossed. She stared at him a moment, then exhaled. Okay, look. Bud gave a knowing grunt. Yep, knew it. Freedom shifted, glancing at the mirror, anywhere but at him. Listen, she said, her voice dropping. It's my brother. Salvation Republic got him. Bud leaned his shoulder against the door frame, arms folded across the hard line of his ribs. He watched her without speaking. Freedom stood there, her bare feet shifting on the cracked floorboards, and her shirt loose on her body. She smiled at him. A smile that belonged in the dark, all teeth and hunger. When you gonna take me? She said, not shy, not gentle, just a blade between them twisting slow. Bud's jaw worked, but he didn't answer, just stared at her through the mess of the room. His boots heavy on the floor. Maps and rags and blades littered every surface, and the stink of unwashed clothes and blood dried into wood. A bed with no sheets but a single rumpled blanket, stained from too many nights without peace. Freedom came closer, her hands dragging down the front of her thighs like she was brushing off dust, but there wasn't any dust there. She wanted his eyes, wanted his hands, wanted his violence. I know that look you gave in the mess hall, she said, voice dropping to a scrape. Bud's mouth twitched, not a smile, more like a man chewing on the idea of what it would cost to break something that was already broke. I don't mind killing, he said, slow and dead. But what I can't figure is why you ain't tell town. Freedom's smile wilted but didn't die. It changed and grew sharper. Her hand twitched at her side like she wanted to grab him, hit him, pull him down. I ain't stupid, she said. I know how he'd be. He'd hear Lib's name and he'd end in right there, just to save himself the trouble. Bud moved a little closer, the floor winding under his boots. So that's why Talon ain't know about this, he said. Freedom nodded. Her hair fell in front of her eyes, and she didn't push it back. She liked him looking at her half-hidden, liked feeling small under his gaze. Yeah, she said, that's why. She took a breath like she was about to say more, but didn't, just stood there, skin prickling. She wanted him to hurt her. She wanted him to take something from her. Bud crossed the last of the distance, standing just a breath away from her. He smelled blood and sweat and something sweeter underneath. What's his name? He asked. Liberty, she said, her voice catching on it like a splinter. Bud shook his head, dry, grim. Freedom and liberty, fucking hell, y'all never had a chance. Freedom laughed, and it sounded half like a sob. Guess not, she said. She leaned toward him like a plant twisting toward light it couldn't reach. But you always been my chance. Bud didn't say anything. He took the scrap of paper she held out to him, their fingers brushing, her nails dragging lightly over his skin, leaving little trails like tiny cuts. She did it on purpose, wanted him to feel it, wanted him to bleed, even just a little. Come on, you may want to choke me and fuck me like that other night. Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving her standing there with her fists balled in the fabric of her shirt, breathing hard like a girl lost in a fever dream she didn't know how to wake from. From the hallway, he said, "When you know when you're ready to go, we'll get it over with." The hallway stank of wet cement and iron and pungence, and Bud walked, and his boots clapped hollow on the concrete, and his breath was shallow as he churned his thoughts. He turned the corner, and the light bleached him white for a second as he passed under a dying overhead bulb. He cut through the mess hall, and in some strange way he was aimless but sure, and his eyes caught the table where he'd sat not 15 minutes before. The pack still nested there. Jinx and Bill hunched forward in low conversation, their heads bowed. Mallory sat back with one leg slung over the other, and she chewed on something and listened to the two men banter, her eyes roving like she'd already guessed the end of things. And Paula had sat down with them while Budsworth was gone, and she caught his eye and smiled at him. Her smile was something she always wore, too eager, too bright in a place like this. Bud never liked it. He always thought it was built on sand. He didn't slow till he caught sight of the MAC-10 sitting brazen on the tabletop, shining under the mess hall lights like some black beetle. Jinx lounged beside it, arms crossed and posture loose. Too young to know better or too dumb to learn. Bud stepped up and slapped him upside the head hard and fast. "Get that off the table," he yelled. "What's wrong with you?" Bill and Mallory flinched, and they sat upright like they'd been shocked. "Damn, actually?" said Jinx, lifting his brow and showing a half smile. Surprise lighting his face like a match flared in the dark, and the half smile was more of a nervous tick than a real thing. "Yeah, actually, fool," said Bud. Jinx moved quick and grabbed the piece and tucked it under his coat, sheepish, like a schoolboy caught talking during prayer. Bud's gaze lingered a second longer. Then he turned and continued across the room. Behind him came a low rumble of laughter, starting with Bill, then Mallory's dry chuckle, then Jinx cracking a knuckle and grinning through it all like it was just a good story being born. Bud heard it echo even as the mess hall door clicked behind him, sealing that little world off. He walked down the hall past the blood marks on the wall no one ever scrubbed clean, past the busted water pipe still leaking from the time John Wyatt threw a chair at it in some fight nobody remembered. He walked like a man with no home, but still went home all the same. His room sat down the bend to the left, past the old generator cage, past the bones of an overhead vent that hadn't blown air in years. The door was marked by a strip of sunken concrete, just low enough to trip a man if he weren't looking. Bud had seen men stumble there before, and he'd watched them curse and catch themselves and glance around embarrassed, and he'd never warned anyone. He stepped over it without looking. In the dim hum of the room's single light, Bud stood before the mirror like a man at judgment. The glass was cracked in a jagged tragon across his reflection. It split him into 3 warped versions of himself, each worse than the last. His face came back to him through it. Broad, thick-jawed, the nose crooked from breaks that never healed right. A constellation of scar tissue across the cheekbones and brow, then that one line from his brow to his lip where he had been bashed with that rifle stock. His eyes were set close and heavy, and the left one carried a yellowing ring around the iris from a burst vessel, a badge from time he no longer remembered. His mouth was drawn thin and often bloodless, lips pale and cracked, and he looked like a man who'd never drank water and didn't trust the ones who did. He reached up and shrugged off the flannel, the fabric dark with sweat around the shoulders, and the sleeves rolled stiff from dried blood at the cuffs. He tossed it at the foot of the cot, where it hit with a sound like damp rags. The bed barely shifted under his weight when he sat. His arms hung low and wide off his sides, great gnarled things like the roots of a live oak. Muscle poured over his shoulders and down the channels of his back, muscle that should have atrophied but never did. He reached for the burlap sack that leaned in the corner and drew it into his lap, rummaged through it slow and quiet. And when he pulled out the locket, it caught the light, a soft gleam in the gloom. He popped it open with his thumb. Inside, the painted light of Le Grand Canal shone through. Brushstrokes like streaked glass, buildings leading into the water, and a pale wash of sky folded into the glimmering canal. The colors bled into each other like a dream half remembered. He studied it like a man who ain't never been nowhere but knows the ache of a place anyhow. A knock broke the stillness, and he looked up. The door stood part open, and Cade leaned there, shoulder on the jamb but not resting, not truly. His posture all affect, and his fingers curled close to his chest. His eyes flitted to Budsworth and away again, shadowed under the spill of his hair that was nigh too long. The stubble on his face made him look unfinished, a thing not yet chosen by time to be young or grown. "Yep," Bud muttered, not looking away from his locket. "You seen where town's got any hold up?" said Cade. Bud turned his head, just slightly, locket still in hand. "What of it?" he said, as he ran his calloused finger down the locket's spine like it would soothe him. Kate hesitated. "He's got me in the basement, in that little room with the mattress, right next to the prisoners." Bud leaned back a bit, jaw working slow. He looked at the boy. "Already complaining, are we?" "It's fine," said Cade, pushing off the doorway. He began to slide his feet across the floor as he turned, and his soles whispered over the concrete like he meant not to be heard. Bud watched him go. The sight of him all bones and nerves, and that cautious look of a dog that's been kicked but still follows you home. "Ah, hell," Bud said. "I'll talk to him. Get you someplace fit for a man." Kate turned, the look on his face all twisted with hope, like he hadn't expected a thing, and was suspicious when it came. "Really?" he said. "Go on now, and don't be all sappy," Bud said. "Around here you gotta work for yours. But you don't did it this time around. You work for more than that." "Thank you, sir," said Cade. Budsworth squinted one eye and brought up one hand and flicked it at him. "Yeah, go on, get out of here." Cade took a step, but turned back. "What's that you got?" he asked, nodding at the locket in Bud's hand. "Nothing," Bud said, and he snapped the locket shut with a quiet click. "Scram." Cade nodded and left, barefoot and half ghost, and Bud sat alone again in the low dark.